Good afternoon. I'm Jamie Allen Black, CEO of the Jewish Women's Foundation of New York. Thank you all for being here today. We welcome you to our ongoing series of conversations with our grantee partners. We call them Jewels. Someday I'm going to do a quiz. Jewels, go. Jewish, entrepreneurial, women, executives, and leaders. Women who have founded and are leading nonprofits that are addressing today's most pressing issues around the world in the Jewish community and beyond. For those of you who don't know us well, and as a reminder for those who do, we have granted more than $6 million to over 300 programs to empower and improve the lives of girls and women. That 25 years of experience in grant making led us to the work we're doing today, supporting these Jewish women social entrepreneurs and leaders who are using a Jewish and gender lens to affect change through their work. These women are on the front lines of the COVID crisis, supporting women impacted by poverty, mass incarceration, gender violence, education, and as Rabbi Benay Lappe, our speaker today, will tell you, creating a more welcoming Jewish community by making sacred texts accessible to everyone. They are the leaders we need right now, and we're proud to elevate their voices. We hope you'll join us in supporting these inspirational women in their groundbreaking work, and we're able to provide them with this platform through donations from people like you. The donation link is in the chat box, and you can also donate on our website, jewishwomen.org, and feel free to look around. We have a lot of great stuff on there. Our conversation today is with Rabbi Lappe, the founder and Rosh Yeshiva of SVARA, a traditionally radical yeshiva. SVARA is dedicated to the serious study of Talmud through the lens of queer experiences. Benay will share with us what makes SVARA different from other yeshivas, how SVARA has brought their programming increasingly online in response to social distancing measures, and what she sees on the horizon for SVARA and for Judaism. What a great time of year to be looking at these very topics. Before we begin, a bit of Zoom housekeeping. If you have questions for Benay, send them directly to Natasha Mayer, host, by selecting her name in the chat box. We've muted everybody to avoid background noise, so the chat feature is the best way to make sure your message is seen. And now, I'm proud to introduce the president of the Jewish Women's Foundation of New York, our very own Rachel Weinstein.
Thank you, Jamie. Thank you. And Benay, I'm so looking forward to chatting with you. Shana Tova, I hope you had a wonderful and meaningful holiday.
Thank you, I did, and a Shana Tova to you as well. Thank you.
And I'm really excited to talk to you about the work of SVARA today, but just given that, we are just coming off of the high holidays and we're about to go into Sukkot, and it's this time of year, this time of reflection, of renewal, I thought I'd ask you, what have you been thinking about this high holiday season? What's been on the top of your mind?
I think what I've been most conscious of is even more than a one day at a time kind of approach. I've been taking a one moment at a time approach. And both the world around us, the challenge of being in a pandemic, the challenge of being called to show up in the world in a way that may be different from how we've been showing up before, has converged with a number of things in my consciousness. The Talmud, my readings on anti-racism, particularly Ibram Kendi, what I've read of wisdom from Anne Lamott, and they all seem to converge this year on the idea of what it means to, in the spiritual practice of being aware of what's right in front of you right now. Anne Lamott's Torah, one of her pieces of Torah is this idea of bird by bird. And I wrote a piece about it last week, so forgive me, those of you who may have read it. But what she tells a story about when she was a kid and her brother, who was about 10 years old, had a book report to do on birds. It was due the next day, even though it had been assigned months before. And he's sitting at the kitchen table with piles of books about birds and binders and pencils. And he's just in despair and about to cry. And she says that their father sat down next to him and put his arm around her brother and said, "Take it bird by bird, buddy. bird by bird. And so that's coming at me like in one year. And a text in the Talmud that I've always loved is rising up for me in a new way. And it's this text that says, you should imagine that you're being judged every day, not just on Yom Kippur, even though Yom Kippur is kind of the dress rehearsal for the final judgment, actually every day, as if you're going to be judged on the majority of your deeds. And in order to do that, you should pretend that you're equally balanced, that you're walking through the world with an equal number of good deeds and bad deeds. And the next deed you do, the next word you say, the next action you take is going to tip your balance. And that's going to determine not who you are, but what you are in that moment. And Rashi pipes up there and he says, that's what it means to be a tzaddik. It's to, in that one moment, do something good. So being a tzaddik is not like being this perfect, never making a mistake, righteous person. It's a person who just did the right thing. And a moment later, you're going to lose that status. And a moment later, you can regain it. And so that's converging with what I've just read of Ibram Kendi. And I actually didn't mean to make this sound like a Devar Torah. I hope it doesn't. But this is what's in, okay, this is what's in my mind lately. So Ibram Kendi, I'm going to read this quote. He says, the good news is that racist and anti-racist aren't fixed identities. We can be a racist one minute and an anti-racist the next. What we say about race, what we do about race in each moment determines what, not who we are. So all these things are coming together to make me think that I'm just going to think about my next moment. Okay, and then I'm going to blow it. And okay, I'm going to get over it. And then I'm going to look at the next moment. So that's where my head is at these days.
I love that. And it's funny because, and I think there are some people listening today who will have heard me say this very week. I started the pandemic going day by day, and I've moved into minute by minute. So It's so funny. And what I love about what you said is, you know, on Yom Kippur, we ask forgiveness of God, we ask forgiveness of other people, but what you're talking about almost allows us to ask forgiveness of ourselves, right? To know that we're going to be imperfect, to know that we're going to get it wrong. And there's this little bit of, you know, okay, we're going to do the best that we can. I love what you just said. So
yeah,
thank you for that. So we've got a lot of people on today who are new, some who are new to the foundation, many who are new to you, who will not know about SVARA. So maybe we could just start with you sharing with all of us a little bit about the work that you do at SVARA.
Sure. So SVARA is a traditionally radical yeshiva. That's what comes to the right of the colon. Of course, we have to have a colon in our name, and that's what is the explanation of what SVARA is. So maybe I'll unpack a little bit about first what is a yeshiva, and then what do we mean by traditionally radical. A yeshiva is some combination of zendo, school, and think tank. That's what a yeshiva was always meant to be. That's what the original yeshivot 2,000 years ago were. They were places that helped you grow as a human being through the spiritual practice of learning. That's the zendo part of it. The academy part of it is that it's a place where people who want to get really serious about rolling up their sleeves and being a part of changing the tradition, improving the tradition, and improving the world informed by Jewish ideas, really learn the texts and the principles and the concepts of the tradition in order to use them. And then it's like a think tank, because just as the first yeshivot were created in the first century after the destruction of the temple, when we were trying to figure out, okay, what do we do now? It was a lot about, okay, let's dream up a tradition that is going to work without a temple. Let's dream up a tradition that's going to work with the new ideas, that the better ideas, the better guesses we have now about what we think God wants of us and how to create a liberatory world than the first guess, which was called the Torah. So that's what a yeshiva is. The yeshivas have not of late, and I'm going to say the last several hundred years, really been that. Yeshivas have sort of devolved into indoctrination programs. But this is what a yeshiva was always meant to be. And I think we're both re-envisioning and retaking on a very old definition. And the traditionally radical part is about the insight that happened for me as a queer person learning Talmud and bringing my queer life experience and lens to everything I was learning. And what jumped out at me were stories that contradicted the story about Judaism that I was told. I was told, like a lot of us learned, Torah is fixed, unchanging, immutable, eternal, and that's what it is. And take it or leave it. You know, if you don't like it, sorry, you either have to suppress that little voice that says something's wrong here, or you have to leave. And the Judaism that I saw that was jumping out at me when I learned Talmud was, that's not how it works at all. And why are we lying to people? Because there's actually a third option beside take it or leave it. It's make it better. And the problem that we're ultimately in business to solve is the fact that for 2,000 years, this tradition, the inner workings of it, which have shaped people into a certain kind of person, and the tools with which to fix it have been accessible to 1% of the Jewish population. Men, heterosexual men, cisgendered men, men who believe in God a certain way and practice Judaism a certain way. So the yeshiva world and the spiritual technology of Talmud study has been utilized by 1% of our population. What's miraculous is that we've done so well with just 1%. I mean, we could debate about actually how well have we been doing, but I think it's amazing that we've done as well as we've done. And SVARA exists to bring all of that to the other 99%. So it's really about a who. It's all about who. It's who's at the table, what team is on the field, because who gets to dig into how it really works, who gets to use the tools, makes all the difference in the what and changes the why. Okay, so I don't know. That's SVARA.
That's SVARA. And obviously you've explained really well where you saw this need, right? I mean, was there a specific impetus to the creation of SVARA, and why SVARA? Why that name? What does SVARA mean?
Yeah, I also realized that was sort of a 40,000 feet definition of SVARA, and I'll just give you a little bit about what SVARA looks like on a day-to-day basis. We have what we do is we convene spaces where primarily queer and trans people, and don't let me forget to tell you why we focus on queer and trans people. We're queer and trans people, and anyone else who wants to join us, learn the tradition and mess with it. And some people do that once a year during a 5-day queer Talmud camp. Some people do that every morning. We have a 30-minute drop-in learning every morning. Some people do it in semester-long learning. We have fellows that spend 2 years, 1 full year in learning and 1 full year in learning our pedagogy, to become sort of the scalers and delivery system in communities across the country and around the world to create Beit Midrash centered learning communities. Okay, so that's a little picture. Now, how did SVARA get started? There's the inner story and the outer story. The inner story is sort of the personal reason, and the outer story is kind of the highfalutin idea. And so first I'll tell you the very personal, and that is I went to JTS from 1991 to 1997, and at that time JTS did not accept openly gay candidates, and I had been out and had been an activist for a decade, but I had this awakening at a certain moment and realized that we all stood at Sinai, all of us, and this tradition of Torah belongs to all of us. So the rabbinical schools that said, no, it doesn't belong to you queer folk, I was like, that's not right. That's not right. It's actually not theirs to keep from me. And so I had this kind of passionately driven sense of being a I don't know, a rule violator in some justified way. And I went into the closet to learn at the seminary, and I went into the closet for 6 years. And when I came out, I realized in many ways I have not even yet begun to learn, because when you can't be present, and all of us as women who have been in male-dominated or patriarchal spaces know what it feels like when you can't really be, you're there, you're sitting there, but you're not really there. And you know that there are ways you can't speak, and there, you know, you just can't be fully present. And I couldn't be in the closet. So when I came out of rabbinical school, there was no place where I could learn. So I had to start a yeshiva in order for me to have a chance to learn really with my whole self for the first time. So on a very personal level, I started SVARA so that other people would come and play with me in the sandbox, so that I could play, and so that I could really learn and really see, what does this tradition mean to me, and what's going on here, and what can I do with it. So I started SVARA for me. But it didn't really happen until I realized how important it was, not only for me. And I told this story at the convening, and forgive me for those for whom this is a repeat as well. And that is that it was 2003. I was visiting New York, and I was sitting on the subway, June 26, 2003, and I opened up the New York Times. And in 3-inch letters, at least that's how big the letters felt to me, the headline read, Supreme Court overturns sodomy laws. The Lawrence decision had just been passed, and that was the Supreme Court decision that overturned all of the states' sodomy laws, those states that had sodomy laws. And I began to cry, because in that moment, I knew the world had just changed. When I was born, the year I was born, it was a felony to live as a gay person in all 50 states. And when I came out, I knew two things. No internet, this is in the 70s, no internet, no Will and Grace, no Ellen, right? I did not know another gay person. I knew two things. I knew they put people like me in jail, because that was the law. And who I am is against God and Torah. And in that moment, I knew that no other gay kid was ever going to come out and think they put people like me in jail. And I knew that that case had come to the Supreme Court because Lambda Legal, a gay and lesbian legal advocacy organization, had brought that case to the Supreme Court. And I realized that the world had just changed because queer people went to law school. And I knew that the Jewish world wasn't going to change until queer people went to yeshiva as queer people. And I started SVARA to be that yeshiva. And that's how we began. And you ask, why is it called SVARA, and what does that word mean? Like every legal system, Jewish law acknowledges certain sources of truth that you can point to and say, I know that this thing needs to change in our tradition because I have this source, because of this line in the Torah is a source, or because of what this wise person said. Oh, Rabbi Lizzie said this. Okay. Rabbi Eliezer said this. Rabbi Akiva. Okay, that's a source. Or because of custom. Look at what the people are doing. That's a source. And the rabbis came up with 4 sources in addition to Torah, one of which is one's moral intuition, one's lived life experience, which informs your sense of how the world should be and could be. That's moral intuition. And the rabbis called that SVARA. And they said this source of law is equal to the Torah itself and even can overturn Torah. Now, as a queer person, as someone to whom others pointed at verses and said, you can't be queer, you can't be this, you can't be that, you can't be a woman and do this, you can't be queer and do that, because it says so right here, the idea that that has actually not been true for 2,000 years, that that's the end of the conversation, but rather that any learned person's svara can overturn Torah was a very, very powerful concept to me. And, you know, I'm on a crusade to popularize the word svara. If I have my way, every Hebrew school is going to teach Shabbat, Tikkun Olam, Tzedakah, and svara. Okay? So we all need to refine and develop our svara and use it to push back against, to expand, to improve our tradition and the world. Okay, so that's how SVARA came about.
For sure. I mean, the idea of moral intuition is being tested daily at the moment, and we all have to dig deep and find it and carry it out there with us every single day. So I agree. We should be teaching it in the same way we're teaching tzedakah, because it's a beautiful, beautiful concept.
Amazing. Yeah, and what's you have to add to the idea of SVARA is whose SVARA. In other words, you have to bring to the table people whose svara has been shaped by being on the margins, right? Traditions don't get better by the people messing with them being the ones for whom it's already been working really well, okay? Rabbinical schools are doing the wrong thing when they accept into their first year class the folks who have been in youth group and then Hillel, and you know, they've been the Boy Scouts all along. Those are the wrong people. You don't want the people for whom the tradition's working best. You want the people for whom it's working least and are most invested in making it better and who know where to start fixing. So those are the people whose svara you want to bring into conversation with the tradition.
So interesting, and leads me into my next question, really, because we talked about this in our pre-call, but, you know, can you share with us a little bit then how you see SVARA differing from other LGBTQ inclusion projects? Because, you know, along the lines of what you're saying, you see it very differently.
Yeah, absolutely. So the first thing I want to point out is that you said other LGBTQ inclusion organizations. Okay, so SVARA is not an LGBTQ inclusion project. So I want to talk about why we're not about inclusion and what inclusion is and why I think inclusion I'd like to say it's wrong-headed. Maybe at the very least, it's too little, too late. But for the most part, I think that it's not going to get us where we really want to go. Okay, so what is inclusion about? Inclusion is saying, you know, I heard earlier in the call, welcoming. Actually, Jamie, we're not about being welcoming, okay? We are actually not about getting the mainstream Jewish world to, quote unquote, welcome us or include us. Well, one of these days, I'm going to write an article called Please Don't Include Me. Okay, why is that? Because inclusion takes as its assumption that the values, norms, worldview of the space are a given. Those are going to stay the same. Those aren't in question. The question is, are you going to let other people who have different values, insights about life, worldviews, are you going to let them in? And that's really good for nobody, because, you know, we know what it's like as women to be let into a space that feels like we're being made honorary men. It's like that space doesn't, right? You know what I'm talking about? That space doesn't let all of your fabulous, glittery woman wonderfulness into the space. It's like you become impoverished, and the space remains as impoverished as it was in the areas where it needs to learn. So I don't know. I once said this at a large gathering, and someone in the audience said, well, if you live in Decatur, inclusion is really good. I get that. Decatur is a small town in southern Illinois. I guess if the alternative is sort of violent rejection, I guess inclusion is better, but we shouldn't imagine that inclusion is our goal. And inclusion is never going to adequately surface and utilize the insights of those people being so-called included, nor will it challenge the assumptions and norms of the space. So getting heteronormative Jewish spaces to quote unquote include queer people, it's not what we're going for. And I think the alternative is people who have been marginalized creating spaces that have in their DNA the insights and values and worldview of those spaces. I'm incredibly inspired, for example, by Amud, the Jews of Color Torah Academy. And it's Torah for Jews of color being taught by Jews of color. I think that's the right approach. You know, there's this whole saying that if donkeys read Torah, the donkey stories would all jump out at us. And as a queer person, when I started learning Talmud and Torah, my donkey stories started jumping out. Oh my God, look at these stories. I'm not talking about, you know, queer 1.0 stories like Jonathan and David and Ruth and Naomi. That was 20 years ago. I'm talking about the stories that make it obvious that the verse pointers are telling a lie. The stories that tell about how we have radically overturned our tradition for 2,000 years in dozens and dozens and dozens of cases when it was necessary. That's a donkey story that, as a queer person, jumped out at me. As a white person, I have no idea what donkey stories are going to jump out for Jews of color, for disabled Jews, for, okay, they need their spaces just like we needed as women, spaces where we could talk to each other and be who we are, compare notes. So all that is a long way of saying SVARA is not an inclusion project. We are creating um, alternative and new centers of Jewish community that many from the old spaces have come to and gone, oh my God, this is so much more liberatory for me, and I'm a straight person. And that's great. It wasn't designed for you, this space, but the people that come out of this space are the people who are going to create the Judaism for everybody. Just like the feminist project isn't ultimately about women. It's about creating a world that's going to be better for everybody. The queer spaces aren't ultimately about queer people. They're about what we can bring to the whole world. Okay.
Fabulous. And you're creating a movement. And while you're based in Chicago, you now have SVARA communities all over the country, correct? And internationally too?
Yes. Yeah, that's true. That's true.
That's amazing. And it's all being taught, because I just wanted to clarify for a listener who asked a question in the chat about, they're all being taught by queer Jews who have gone through your program, who are leading queer communities through studying Talmud, through the queer lens, and anybody else who wants to join, great, but that's the focus.
That's right. That's right.
Right.
The focus really being queer normative space.
Yeah.
And you have to have still a majority of queer identified folks for that space to be a queer normative space. Just like as feminists, we're not quite there. You know, there can be guys who are feminists for sure. Can there be a space that's all men and feminists? Maybe. I don't know. I'm not sure.
Not sure either.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So I'm just going to switch gears a little bit. I think I can speak for most of us when I say the last 6 months have been challenging, right? Between the pandemic, the racial injustice, the divisions in our country, it's a lot to hold. And here you are, someone who, while you're not a rabbi in terms of having a pulpit, you're a rabbi in terms of having this community, you're a spiritual leader. What has that been like for you, personally, to be experiencing all this and still trying to be there for a spiritual leader? And second part, what have the spiritual needs of your community been over the last 6 months? How have they shifted, if at all, from, what you were seeing before that?
Yeah. I think the first thing I want to surface is that I'm very lucky because the DNA of SVARA was created to be a place for me. Remember the personal side of the origin story? It was, I'm creating this for me. I'm really not in business. I was never in business to deliver something to somebody else. And so it always had to work for me. And I happen to think that that's, kind of our secret sauce. And I think it should be the secret sauce for any project. If you're creating a program for somebody else, you're doing the wrong thing. You should figure out what you need. Knowing and being confident that there are a lot of people like you out there. Know that you're actually not unique. And if you create what you need, it's going to work for a lot of people. So when the pandemic hit, on the one hand, it was very easy to say, what do I need? What do we as a staff need? Because if we don't make this work for us, it's not going to work for anybody. We're going to be acting. We're going to be, pretending. And if we really get in touch with what we need, it's going to work for people. And what we needed is what everybody needs. We need a kind of trauma-informed approach. It's like the first thing we're all going through is ongoing trauma. And our emotional needs, our needs for connection and community are primary. And hang on, let me ask my daughter to keep it quiet. 1 second. Ma, I'm recording, thanks. I guess I did.
Perfect example of the realities of the moment, right?
So we, and I also want to say that people on the margins, queer people, Black people, women, we know what it's like to live through and live with ongoing trauma. All of us. And we're uniquely situated. If we're able to be in that place and be honest and name it and be vulnerable, to create spaces that are going to work, because we're all expert at this. We have our PhDs in ongoing trauma. And we know what we need, and we know what we need to talk about, and we know what we can't focus on. You know, I don't think it's an accident that in our last meeting of the collective, we were talking about self-care and talking about how we can, like, what we need to do to take care of ourselves and our staffs and our organizations right now. And one of the things I walked away with from that meeting was the confidence that, yeah, you know what? I need an effing week off. And everybody on the team gets a week off. We're going to take a week off periodically. It's off time. So that's, I think that's the first layer of what happened. And then for 17 years, we've been sort of in business thinking about crash. And maybe in a minute, I'll talk a little bit about our theory about what happens when systems fail and you realize suddenly that the way you thought things were isn't the way they are. So we know a lot about that. And we are about surfacing the technologies and the tradition that help people become what we call crash flex. So we were really crash flex when the pandemic hit, and it was very easy for us to experiment and to throw down new kinds of programs and develop new methodologies. We were already partly online anyway. So our pivot was pretty seamless.
That's great. Well, maybe we can talk about, I'm going to reverse, maybe I want you to follow up on that idea of crash, because you had said to me that the pandemic you felt was highlighting what you term as a crash of Judaism. So maybe you can just explain what you mean by that term, and what you see as the remedy.
Yeah, so in short, I believe that traditions come about to answer our basic human questions. That's their job. And they do so by a whole constellation of practices, holidays, rituals, prayers, maybe spiritual practices. And as long as those practices are working for you, you're getting your big human questions answered and your needs met. But ultimately and inevitably, these systems, whether religious or secular, will ultimately and inevitably crash. Something will happen in the world that will make those practices no longer work. Or you'll find another story whose answers you like better. Or something inside of you will have changed in your old tradition, your tradition's old answers. They just no longer seem true. And that's what we call a crash. And that happens on personal levels, familial, organizational, institutional, societal. And they happen to traditions. And when that happens, you've got only three possible responses. You can deny the crash. You can say, oh, no, that didn't happen, and revert to your master story. You can say, yeah, that happened and the story is over. The whole thing was a crock and I'm out of here. Or the third option is you can take what still works, use your experience or what has happened in the world, what has crashed the story possibly, and make it better. And Judaism has lived and thrived for thousands of years because we have a native methodology for responding to crashes. 2,000 years ago when the temple was destroyed, that was a big crash. And Judaism as we knew it ceased to exist. And a small group of fringy, marginalized guys, whom we now call the rabbis, cooked up a Judaism which would have been unrecognizable to Jews of the biblical era. And, you know, they cooked up these like wild, newfangled practices like prayer. You know, if you utter these words, God will be with you. Really? I don't know if I would have believed that. Or tzedakah, you don't have to go to a temple. There's no temple. But if you give tzedakah, okay, that would be like God is with you. If you learn, oh, that's God being with you. And, you know, I think that the folks who were presented with this new tradition mostly said, that's a crock. You made that up. It doesn't feel Jewish to me. I'm out of here. But a small number of people said, you know what? This doesn't feel Jewish to me. I see that you've made this up. Even though it doesn't feel Jewish to me, it will to my grandchildren. So I'll come along. And those are our ancestors, whether biological or spiritual. And the rabbis left us a handbook for how to do this. It's called the Talmud. And they left a methodology and the idea that this is traditional. This kind of sometimes radical change is traditional, and thus, right, traditionally radical yeshiva. We've been in a crash for the last 150 years, okay? COVID isn't the cause of the crash of Judaism. COVID is an accelerant of the crash or the crumble, you might say, that has been going on for 150 years since the emancipation, enlightenment, the Holocaust, the unprecedented power, relative wealth, inequality of Jews in America, and the old forms that were made for an oppressed, beleaguered minority are not speaking to us anymore. Think about it. When you have 2 challahs on your Shabbos table, why do you have 2 challahs on your Shabbos table? Don't give me a story about the temple. It's not about the temple. Here's why you have 2 challahs on your Shabbos table. Because for 6 days out of the week, you can't afford a single challah. But 1 day a week, you have 2 challahs and you feel like a mensch. This is what it feels like to have dignity. And you can take that dream and live the rest of your 6 days of your week trying to make that a reality in life. That's a technology that works if you can't afford the challahs the rest of the week. But what happens when you can afford a dozen challahs any day of the week? That practice doesn't work anymore. Yeah. So our tradition is in this crumble. The ways we've been doing Jewish have been crumbling. And, you know, before COVID, I used to say the rabbis had it easier because their temple actually was burned down. And even though I had to always say, God forbid, I don't want any synagogue to be burnt down, the fact that you could go to any synagogue on any corner gave you the illusion that Judaism was still working, or that institutional Judaism or synagogue-centered Judaism was still working. And for most of us, that was an illusion, and it only left us feeling personally guilty. Like, oh, it's you know, I'm a bad Jew. We're not individually bad Jews. We're living in a period of time in which this way of doing Jewish is no longer compelling or plausible for many of us. But now with COVID, the fact that you can't go to the synagogue on your corner is actually, I think, helping clarify what never worked for many of us. and this is just one example. So I feel like, you know, I've been talking about this for years, and the whole Jewish world has kind of just shown up in my backyard. It's like, okay, let's all talk about this, but let's not think that life is going to, quote unquote, go back to normal Jewishly after the pandemic. We actually don't want it to. We want to use this opportunity to, you know, like we did at SVARA, okay, time to really have some room to experiment. And you know, we have the space, the high holidays that just came. With all of the difficulties, we had the opportunity to experiment with new ways of doing the high holidays and really asking, what are we trying to do here? And were these old ways actually working? How many of these prayers are really good enough to keep if I have to do this online? So I'll leave it there. Maybe we can go into more detail.
To reevaluate and reflect and refine and all the R's.
Yeah.
And when you and I talked last week, because we're running short on time, so I'm going to condense a couple of our questions into one. But when you and I talked last week, you know, I said to you, you know, so many organizations right now, not-for-profit organizations, are contracting, and some are expanding, and some are just barely maintaining the status quo. And when I asked you where you sat there, you said, you know, unequivocally, we're expanding. So maybe you can share with us how you're expanding and what's on the horizons for SVARA.
Yeah, I think because we were able to be suffering along with everybody else and surfacing, you know, the uncertainty and figuring out how to get through this, and we really needed new practices for ourselves. I wasn't learning Talmud every day. I wasn't. But I needed to. And when the pandemic hit, we realized we as a staff, we needed that, and put it out there as a drop-in 30-minute thing, whoever wants to do this with us, and it exploded. And it's not something we ever would have done before, because the pedagogy of a 30-minute learning is very different than a typical SVARA 3-hour super in-depth experience. But we figured out a way to do it in a way that gave us what we needed. So that's just one example. We had, you know, we have 500 people coming to Queer Talmud Camp every year. And we have about 100 people at every camp, and we have a waiting list of several hundred people. And this year we had our largest Queer Talmud Camp ever. Learning, specifically Chavruta-based learning, partner learning, which is very intimate, actually translates surprisingly well to an online virtual space. So our online programs have just grown enormously, and we find ourselves in a better financial position than we were before. And
Mazel tov.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Yeah. So last question before we leave our listeners with some things to do, but how has being part of the JWFNY collective, how, if at all, has it affected your leadership?
Oh my gosh. Well, I gave one tiny example, but I want to say that being in the collective has been, I've been in a number of fellowships and they've all been wonderful, but the collective has been different. The collective has been a space, being an all-women space. And by the way, I want to put as a sidebar, the fact that the Jewish Women's Foundation, I know, understands the word women to mean all women, period. And that's unique. And you don't even need to say it, although I think you should say it so people really get it. Women are women. Women aren't just cisgendered women. Transgender women are women. And that's what you mean when you say women. And that's a very powerful thing. You know, the fact that our cohort of 10 women has 4 queer women, and I don't even know about the rest, but I know there are at least 4 of us who are queer, means a lot. I know that I'm not a token as a queer person in that room. And I know that you didn't choose any of us who are queer because we're queer. And that's not to be taken for granted. And that you understand that work with queer people is a playing out of the largest vision of feminism means a lot. And you don't have to say, we get that. So it's a space where I feel very relaxed, able to just be, and that's really very, very precious and very rare in the Jewish world. To have people who I can call up and say, hey, I don't get this thing. You know, the other women in the cohort, and say, hey, I'm having trouble with this. Hey, what are you doing about that? The conversations about the challenges we're experiencing as leaders are more honest than conversations that I've had with other Jewish leaders anywhere in the Jewish world. So it's been enormously valuable.
Well, I'm so glad that we are creating that space. We're working hard to create that space, and it means a lot to hear when you know, when it's working. And I think it has a lot to do with the women that are a part of it, right? I mean, it's you all who are creating that space, and so thank you for creating that space with us. I know we want to leave our listeners with some action items. We always like to leave our listeners with some action items about you and your work, which I am not sure if you're planning to share or Jamie's planning to share, or we're going to share. Jamie's going to share. So I want to just thank you for taking the time to talk with me today. This has been a real pleasure. You've given me certainly a lot to think about, and I hope others will feel the same way about how we can think more radically about our Judaism. We want it to be a place for our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren and beyond. So what do we need to do? And I love some of your ideas. So thank you for sharing.
Thank you. Can I just leave with one final thought that I wanted to make explicit, but I'm not sure that I did. And that is that SVARA's project ultimately is taking those folks, you know, at the center of the bullseye are queer and trans folk, but for all folks with marginal experiences to be equipped to roll up our sleeves and be a part of creating that new Judaism that may be unrecognizable to us. And we don't know what it's going to look like, but we know that we need a new team on the field. And we think queer people and other marginalized folks are uniquely placed and set up to do that. And that's what we're trying to do, to bring that new team onto the field to create the Judaism of the future. So thank you for giving me the opportunity.
If you build it, they will come.
That's right. That's right.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and your story with us. And thanks, Rachel, for leading us to this conversation. Woo! One quick question, Benay, that someone asked is that do you think that you'll continue your relationships with the collective members after your 3 years with us are up?
Without a doubt.
Okay.
Absolutely.
So I hope you all learned as much as I did today. A great reminder to create spaces where we can be authentic and vulnerable. We love radical change is traditional. We are a long line of women who believe that in traditionally radical change, I mean, everything that we have accomplished is because somebody said, we don't want that. We want something that speaks to us. And we just keep doing that and keep including everyone. And Benay, I was so touched by what you said. I'm not a crier and you made me cry. So there
Oh
we
my
go.
goodness.
We're inspired by your leadership and SVARA's work. So everyone, if you liked hearing from Benay, you will be thrilled to learn about our 2020 convening on Monday, October 26th and 27th, and Tuesday, October 27th. It's online from 10 to 1 Eastern time. Registration is open and the link is in the chat and will be in a follow-up email that's coming on Monday. We'll highlight all of our jewels from cohorts 1 and 2 and some other exciting speakers, fashion designer Rebecca Minkoff, activist, comedian, and mom Rain Pryor, social justice consultant Ruth Messenger, spoken word artist Vanessa Hittery, philanthropist Paula Pretlau, Sally Gottesman, and Alyssa Doctoroff, chef Michelle Bernstein will do a cooking demonstration and talk about food insecurity, and Representative Alma Hernandez, who is the first Jewish Latina woman to serve in a state legislature. So we're really excited. And as our treasured board member, Stephanie Gary, said, now is the time to make the time to be inspired. And so I hope you will all join us in that. We like to leave you with a few actions that you can take. So here we go. These will be in the follow-up email, but support Benay and SVARA by watching and sharing her Eli talk. It's awesome. Invite Benay and SVARA to your community by emailing Ayana Morse. Email will be in the email you get from us. Sign up for one of SVARA's upcoming workshops. They're really exciting and you will not be sorry. We'll share all of those links. When you directly support Benay and SVARA, you join us in supporting a world in which everyone has the opportunity to fall in love with their Jewish heritage and tradition and make it their own. Thank you, Benay, Rachel, and all of you for being with us today. We will see you later this month and have a wonderful evening. Thank you so much.